Right now, Red Hat is an infinite well of content. All they had to do was stop talking. Every time they talk, they make the situation worse. No matter where you stand on the Red Hat source code situation, you have to admit they're really not great at communicating their point. If they just left it alone, people would forget over time. The problem is nobody ever stops talking. So Red Hat posted a follow-up over to Twitter. We will always send our code upstream and abide by the open source licenses our products use, which includes the GPL. Red Hat's Mike McGrath expands upon the recent CentOS stream changes. And it links to a further blog post, Red Hat's commitment to open source, a response to the git.centos.org changes. Before we get into this, I want to make something very clear. Going around and harassing Red Hat employees, harassing Fedora contributors, or just someone who uses one of these systems, whether they support the changes or don't support the changes, is not at all productive. This is not a change being made by those low-level Red Hat engineers, and especially not by those community Fedora contributors. This is a change being made from on high at Red Hat. It's one thing to voice your concerns, but please don't be weird about it. So then, let's get started. This is being written by Mike McGrath, the Vice President of Core Platforms Engineering at Red Hat, who's been there for 16 years, and before that was a community Fedora contributor. This is someone who's been involved in this space for a really, really long time. Now, despite what's currently being said about Red Hat, we make our hard work readily accessible to non-customers. I'll get into this in just a bit. Red Hat uses and will always use an open source development model. When we find a bug or write a feature, we contribute our code upstream. This benefits everyone in the community, not just Red Hat and our customers. This point was really never part of the discussion. I've seen some weird people saying, they might pull their code and try to break the Linux kernel, but that just doesn't really make any sense to do. Much like companies like Google, Amazon, IBM, Meta. These are companies far, far larger than Red Hat. All of these companies contribute code upstream because it's not just beneficial to other projects, it's beneficial to them. If they make a project better, that's going to make more people want to work on that project and make the project better and better and better, so they don't have to go and just develop everything themselves. Outside of things like the Linux kernel, Red Hat engineers also work on things like GNOME, Systemd, and a bunch of other projects that many of us use on a day-to-day basis. While it is totally fair to not like the companies they come from, the work these developers do should absolutely be appreciated, and really the FOSS world wouldn't be able to function like it does today without a lot of these people's contributions. We don't simply take upstream packages and rebuild them. You're going to see this is a fairly recurring theme throughout the article. At Red Hat, thousands of people spend their time writing code to enable new features, fixing bugs, integrating different packages, and then supporting that work for a long time, something that our customers and partners need. And yes, Red Hat engineers, as I said, do a lot of incredible work. However, I kind of disagree with their phrasing here, because Red Hat, like most of the projects out there, are built on the backs of giants. Without all of this work that community contributors have done, whether that be on the GNU project in the early days, on FFmpeg, on your browser, on your desktop environment, on your graphics stack, and all of these other things, which I'm sure Red Hat has a part in developing, without that work from the community, products like RHEL simply wouldn't be possible. Same with pretty much every other distro out there. When we develop fixes for issues in RHEL, we don't just apply them to RHEL. They are applied upstream first to projects like Fedora, CentOS Stream, or the kernel project itself, and we then backport them. Now, this is mostly true in most situations. There are some issues where they're placed under embargo first. They make their way into RHEL, and then once the embargo is lifted, then they are released publicly. That is absolutely the exception and not the rule though. But I do not doubt that maintaining and supporting an operating system for 10 years is a Herculean task, and there's enormous value in the work we do. Absolutely. And that's why projects like CentOS existed in the past, and nowadays you have things like Alma Linux and Rocky Linux. I know we've been fairly positive so far, But do not worry, Red Hat is not backing down from their position. In fact, you could argue they are doubling down. I feel that much of the anger from our recent decision around the downstream sources comes from either those who do not want to pay for the time, effort, and resources going into RHEL, or those who want to repackage it for their own profit. This demand for RHEL code is disingenuous. Remember that part where I said Red Hat should stop talking? Things like this is why. This is how you annoy people that already don't like you. Red Hat, my DMs are open. There are some Red Hat engineers who can get in contact with me. If you want to post a blog post that you feel maybe possibly might annoy the community, send it to me first and I will happily proofread it for you. I don't even need a payment. Just send me the blog post to make sure things like this don't get posted. We've found a group of users, many of whom belong to large or very large IT organizations that want the stability, lifecycle, and hardware ecosystem of RHEL without having to actually support the maintainers, engineers, writers, and many more roles that create it. These users also have decided not to use one of the many other Linux distributions. Ultimately, we do not find value in a RHEL rebuild and are not under any obligation to make things easier for rebuilders. This is our call to make. And yes, they are absolutely correct that it is their call to make. Really, if they wanted to, they could say, send us a letter and we'll send you back a bunch of CDs containing the RHEL source code. This would be a perfectly valid way to fulfill the requirements under the GPL. And if they want, they can have the source code behind a login screen where only customers of Red Hat can access it. And if maybe you go and use that source code to rebuild a clone of RHEL, well, you're allowed to do that. But you don't have to be a Red Hat customer anymore, and they don't have to provide you with future versions. This is totally within their right to do. They are allowed to do this. The real problem is whether they should do this. This is where the main disagreement arises. Red Hat wants to run a business. A really successful business at that. Yes, they did have the mass layoffs recently, but they're still by far the biggest company in the entire FOSS world. And to do this, they need to charge for the product they offer. We have to pay the people to do that work. Those passionate contributors grinding through those long hours and nights, simply repackaging the code that these individuals produce and reselling it as is with no value added, makes the production of this open source software unsustainable. However, on the flip side, you have the rest of the FOSS world. They want to redistribute everything, because that is their Stallman given right to do so. There is no license fee to access the code, it is just there. And if someone wants to go and copy a project, rebrand it, and now say it's mine, they're well within their right to do so. And this is effectively what Alma Linux and Rocky Linux are doing. Whilst it may not be financially viable for companies to exist in this space, you're well within your right to freeload off of existing FOSS code. I know some people are getting a little bit antsy about the term freeloading, but breaking it down to its core, that is what it is, and you are allowed to do so. If I want to take a distro like Arch Linux and rebrand it into Concave Linux, I can do that. If I want to take a distro like Fedora Linux and rebrand it into Trilby Linux, I can do that as well. And if you're a company operating in this space like Red Hat is, someone is going to take RHEL and rebrand it into Alma Linux, Rocky Linux, or even Oracle Linux. It would be lovely to have a world where nobody needs to worry about rent, nobody needs to worry about food, all of your bills are paid for, and you can just work on FOSS code and just do it for the benefit of society. But that's just not the world we live in, and I can understand from Red Hat's perspective why facilitating this practice is just not viable to running a business. However, I can also fully understand why the FOSS world would want to go and just take something that exists and rebrand it, because that's something you can do with pretty much everything else. However, they do have a slightly different stance when it comes to distros that aren't a direct rebuild. I want to specifically mention the rebuilders. These are your Alma Linux, Rocky Linux, things like that, as different from distributions that might, for example, add a new architecture or compile flag. We fully support you in expanding Linux capabilities rather than imitating them. So if you wanted to go and take RHEL, for example, and then take it in a completely new direction, he's saying, at least here, that that would be okay. I'd want that written in a legally binding contract before I tried to use something like RHEL as a base. But he's at least saying it here. So if you wanted to go and make a new Fedora, for example, using RHEL as your upstream, He's saying that would be okay. But they didn't always have this stance. There was a time where Red Hat had a more, let's say, maybe not friendly, but less adversarial stance with these rebuilders. There was a time not too long ago that Red Hat found value in the work done by rebuilders like CentOS, and that's why you bought them. We pushed our SRPMs out to git.centos.org in a neat package that made them easy to rebuild. We even debranded it for them. More recently, we have determined there isn't value in having a downstream rebuilder. The generally accepted position that these free rebuilds are just funnels churning out RHEL experts and turning into sales just isn't reality. I don't know if this is like corporate speak, but I don't know how you could ever have the stance that using the thing that is identical to your product is ever going to lead to people buying your product. Like, say, for example, there is an Apple store, and there is a guy outside the Apple store giving out free iPhones. Who are you going to get the iPhone from? He also touches on the whole closed source thing that a lot of people were spreading around. The CentOS Stream GitLab source is where we build RHEL releases, in the open for all to see. To call RHEL closed source is categorically untrue and inaccurate. CentOS Stream moves faster than RHEL, so it might not be on head, but the code is there. If you can't find it, it's a bug, please let us know. Or it's under embargo. I don't know why they're just ignoring the fact that they do embargo code. Like, that's not a secret. So this is the CentOS Stream GitLab, and you can find the source code here. Now, I can understand how people got to the point closed source, because they didn't do themselves any favors here. Red Hat customers and partners can access RHEL sources via the customer and partner portals in accordance with their subscription agreement. Now, it does say earlier in this post, CentOS Stream will now be the sole repository for public RHEL-related source code releases, but they never linked to the CentOS Stream GitLab. I assumed that wherever the repository was only accessible to customers and partners, and this is the stance that pretty much everyone else had because you simply didn't say it existed. Once again, proofread your blog post before you actually post it. Now, he ends the blog by saying, simply rebuilding code without adding value or changing it in any way represents a real threat to open source companies everywhere. This is a real threat to open source, and one that has the potential to revert open source back into a hobbyist and hackers only activity. So if you weren't sure what position they had on Alma Linux and Rocky Linux, clearly it is they shouldn't exist, and if they're going to exist, they shouldn't be a one-to-one clone of RHEL. They should be their own thing that brings something unique to the table. And from Red Hat's perspective, I can totally understand why they would want that to happen. But from the community perspective, you are taking away this free option that has basically always existed. CentOS existed for a very long time, you took that away, Rocky Linux and Alma Linux came along to fill that gap, and now you are trying to break it again. Ultimately, I don't know where I completely stand on this. I certainly lean a lot more towards the community side, the side of freedom of free software, but from that business perspective, I can understand why Red Hat has this position. I think the only thing I can say conclusively is Red Hat is absolutely terrible at communication. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Where do you stand on this? Please, I don't want the comment section to turn into an argument, so try to keep it civil. Even saying that, I know it's not going to happen. So let me know your thoughts. If you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Libera Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and hopefully Red Hat doesn't make another blog.
Something like this.